and how teamwork produces lasting change, and that great change is usually made by a lot of people working together, not just one person working by themselves. We looked at how Nehemiah organized hundreds and hundreds of people and hundreds of families to work together to build this massive wall in a short time. The third message that we're going to look at today is opposition to change, because change never comes without opposition. Even personal change. There's always something inside of us that resists that change. And when you try to make a change in an organization or in a church, there's always going to be opposition to change. So we're going to look today at the opposition that Nehemiah faced and how he handled opposition, because he came against tremendous opposition. So let me give you the background first. If you weren't with us the last couple of weeks, we noticed that Babylon had conquered Israel and carried them off into captivity. And in 539 BC, 539 years before Christ was born, God raised up this pagan king named Cyrus the Great. He was the Persian king, and they conquered Babylon. And Babylon had conquered Israel. So when Persia conquered Babylon, they set all the Israelites free. And the Hebrews could go home and go back to Jerusalem and Israel if they chose. And they tended to, after they'd been captive for 50 years in Babylon, they kind of went back in waves. Different groups of settlers go back. They were called the remnant because they were just remnants of the original population that would go back and settle in Israel. When they got back to their beloved country, and especially their beloved city of Jerusalem, they found it in ruins. They were heartbroken because what once had been a magnificent city under King David was now just in shambles. The temple had been destroyed. The walls had been broken down. The gates had been burned. And as we said, in that culture, without solid, strong walls, the city was nothing. They would just be constantly defeated by every group that passed by. So it was imperative that the walls be rebuilt, but it also was impossible with all of the opposition and with the kind of ragtag group of people that they had. It was an impossible task. And then God moved the heart of Nehemiah, a man who held the position of being a cupbearer to the king, moved him to be the guy who would cause this change to happen. He was 800 miles away in Babylon, and he had to do something impossible, and that was to travel back to Israel and to rebuild these massive walls. And God did the impossible. I want to give you 4 steps to change that we see in the life of Nehemiah. And these terms are not original with me. Another pastor tried to put these into real kind of action terms. And he used body parts to help people to understand it. So bear with me on that. But he starts at saying that the beginning of change starts with heartburn. Some of you may be feeling some of that today, and you go, oh, good, that's great, I've got heartburn. I'm not talking about the kind that comes from drinking too much of our coffee, but no offense, it's great coffee. But we're talking about when God convicts you, when God kind of speaks to your heart. Maybe it happens to on a Sunday morning. Maybe it happens when you're praying at home or reading God's Word, and suddenly you feel like God is speaking directly to you, and He's telling you that He wants you to change or He wants you to do something for Him, and your heart burns within you, as the disciples said in the Bible. And that heartburn is the beginning of change. It always starts on the inside. And when God begins to convict you on the inside. That's what happened with Nehemiah. When he heard about the condition back in Jerusalem, he just wept and wept for days. He was heartbroken, and something burned inside of him that told him that he had to go and be the one to make the change and to lead the way. So the first step in change is heartburn. The second one is knees bent. These are all going to be 2 words here. Get it? Heartburn. Knees bent. And the knees bent is prayer. And that's one of the great things I love about Nehemiah is every step of the way, his very first reaction is to pray. I have to be honest with you. Sometimes for me, I try everything first, and when I fail in every way, I think, maybe I ought to pray about this. Kind of as a last resort. Nothing else works, I guess I ought to pray. Well, with Nehemiah, it was a first response. As soon as he heard about Jerusalem, he prayed. When he decided to go ask the king for permission to leave, he prayed. And we're going to see him today. Every step he takes, he prays, he prays, he prays. And true change never happens unless there is an absolute commitment to prayer. That's both personally and organizationally as a church. It's one of the reasons why we're going to meet together in 2 weeks, and we're going to pray together for this church, for true change and revival and growth in this church. But it also happens individually. If you want to change, you have to realize that you're not going to be the one to initiate the change. You don't have the strength and the discipline to do that lasting change in your life, but God does. And God can do that, and that's going to require your dependence upon him, and your dependence upon him is demonstrated in prayer. So, you start with the heartburn, and then the knees bent. The third step in change is lips confess. Lips confess. The first thing that Nehemiah did when God put it in his heart to go do this, to go over there, he prayed to God and he confessed the sins of the Israelites. He actually confessed the sins of an entire nation. Have you ever thought to do that? I mean, people talk about the sins of America a lot these days, and it just seems that they just keep getting bigger and greater. And have you ever thought to confess the sins of America? I must admit, I don't think to do that because I've got enough of my own to confess. But he confessed the sins of the nation, and then he confessed his own family's sin as well, and his personal sin. And if you're going to have a relationship with God, confession has to be a regular daily part of your life. If you're going to come to God in prayer, confession is the first step as you cleanse the relationship with him, remove the barrier between you so you can come into his presence and have that close, intimate relationship with him. And so the third step of great change is lips confess. And the fourth step is feet move. He has to put it into action. I have to tell you, there's a lot of times when I have great intentions that never get put into action. You know the old saying that the road to hell is littered with good intentions. There's a lot of people have good intentions and great ideas, but if they don't get put into action, then they're useless. And so Nehemiah not only was convicted by God to do this, and he not only got on his knees and prayed and he confessed his sins, but he took action. And he had to take some pretty bold actions. He had to ask the king for permission to leave, and that alone could have gotten him killed. And then he asked the king not only for permission to leave, but letters of safe travel and even wood to rebuild the gates. And the king threw in some troops to go with him to protect him on his travels. And he had to make a bold move. And then when he got to Israel, he took the bold move of surveying the walls and seeing exactly what needed to be done. And then he took the bold move of gathering people together against the opposition and organizing families and putting families all over the walls to work together. And we're going to see a little bit more of that today in Nehemiah 4. But he put this into action and he accomplished something great. And so those are your 4 steps to change. Heartburn, knees bent, lips confess, and feet move. When you do that, when you make that change, whether it's personal or in a group, there will be opposition. And I want us to look today at how Nehemiah handled opposition. So first I want you to think about yourself. Think about something you've been trying to change in your life. Maybe something you've been trying to change for a long time and you're still trying to change it. You're in process. You haven't failed. You're still in process. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt here. Why do you find it so hard to change? I know why I find it so hard to change, because I actually like routine. I love to get into a nice, comfortable rut and stay there. Routine is comfortable. You know, I know what it's like. I know what's coming and everything. So it's easy for me to get into a routine and stay in the routine and not change. To change means leaving the comfort zone. So we all hear this term status quo. Have you ever looked that up? Do you know what status quo means? It's a Latin term. Status sounds a lot like state, and the Latin term means the state of affairs, as it is. The state of affairs. That's the status quo. So when we maintain the status quo, we are keeping things the way they are. Because we like it the way they are. We're comfortable the way they are. And then when you decide to change, you have to change the status quo. Go against the way things are already. That requires inertia. You remember that study in science class years ago about inertia? A body at rest tends to stay at rest, and a body at motion tends to stay in motion. And inertia is the force that it takes to get a body at rest to start moving. And if your body has not been moving for a while, it takes a lot of effort to get that body moving. And that's one of the reasons when we get into a rut and we haven't changed, and it can take a lot of energy and effort to get us to change, to change the status quo, the state of affairs, and to do something different. There is something inside of us that says, don't change a thing. In fact, they say the 7 last words of a dying church are, we've never done it that way before. You ever heard that? It's deadly. It's deadly when any organization, any church, when that becomes the way of making decisions, well, we've never done it that way before. You can tell that's the beginning of that's the beginning of the end for that church. Not only will we run into internal opposition, the things inside of us that say, don't change, keep things the same. We'll often run into external opposition, others on the outside who don't want to see you change. I heard a pastor give his testimony this week, and he talked about when he was in high school, he was a wild man. He was not a believer in Jesus Christ. He would get drunk all the time. Every weekend he was getting drunk. He was running around with a group of guys, and his whole life was about women and drugs and alcohol and wild parties. And then he went off to college, and he had this incredible conversion and gave his life to Jesus Christ. And he decided for him it was no more getting drunk, no more women, all these things. He was going to clean his life up. When he came back home, he contacted his old buddies. And he said, do you want to go hang out this weekend? And they said, sure. He says, all right, I'll pick you up. So he picked up his old buddies. He hadn't told them anything yet about his conversion. And the first place they wanted to stop was to go get beer, because that's how they always started their evenings. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll take you there, and you can buy all the beer you want, but I'm not going to be drinking any. I'll drive you guys, because I'm going to be sober, because I'm not going to be drinking. And his buddies went, what are you talking about? You're not drinking. And he said they weren't just curious or interested. They were angry. How dare you? What do you mean you're not doing this? And then they went to a party, and they were talking about all the girls that were going to be there. And he says, I'm not going to be hooking up with any of these girls either. I'm really cleaning my life up. What are you talking? What is wrong with you? And they were furious with him. And that's how it went all evening long. He said they were not just surprised. They were really angry that he tried to change. Now, by the way, the end of that line was that several of those guys ended up coming to know Jesus Christ down the road, years later. Initially, they thought it was the worst thing that ever happened, but they discovered that the change that took place in him was real, and it was good, and that they needed to make that change too. And because they saw him change, they too later would change as well. But the initial opposition was they were angry. Have you ever seen that? When a person tries to change and their friends don't want him to change, so they oppose the change. They try to talk him out of it. Don't do that. We want you to be the same person you used to be so we can have fun together. But that can happen in a church as well. I was in a little church in Massachusetts, and they had this huge, big pulpit. It was almost bigger than I was, and I would try to stand behind it and preach. I had to kind of peek over the top, see if anybody was listening or still there. So I finally decided I had to move that pulpit, and with all of my strength, I shoved that pulpit off of the stage, and I replaced it with just a little music stand like this. And the very next week, there was a little lady used to sit right over here on the right-hand side, and she said to me as soon as the service was over, she goes, "Where's the pulpit?" And I told her, I said it was just too big. I couldn't see over the thing, and I moved it off of there. And she said, "Well, we need more oak. There's not enough oak up there." And I never knew that was a requirement for worship, was oak. It's got to be in the Bible somewhere that you have to have the Holy Spirit and the presence of God and oak in order to worship. And she said, "This just isn't my religion anymore because there wasn't enough oak." That's opposition to change. Now, obviously, we're far away from that, so we can look at it reasonably and say, oak has nothing to do with worship, but it did to her because she had seen that oak for 30 years in that big old pulpit. And without the pulpit, she didn't feel like she could worship because she was opposed to change. And so anytime you try to make change in an organization, there will be people who say, we don't like the change. We like the way it was before. We've never done it that way before. So there's always going to be opposition. I want us to look and see how Nehemiah handled the opposition. Now, one of the things we're going to run into is there's going to be an attempt by his enemies to discourage him. And maybe you've run into this before. Because if you try to change, somebody might say to you, oh, you'll never change. That young man who tried to stop drinking, his friends would say, well, this will never last. You're going to go back. We know who you are. Sometimes your friends will say to you, you'll never change. Sometimes parents say it to their kids. When their kids are trying to be a better person, and they'll say, oh, you'll never change. And sometimes you say it to yourself. Because many of you have attempted to make the same change over and over again. I know what it's like. And then when you fail at it, you can be your worst enemy. You can be the one looking in the mirror, saying to yourself, you're a failure. You'll never change. These are words of discouragement. And I believe that it is Satan's greatest weapon is discouragement. And he will try at every turn to discourage you from changing, especially when you're changing for God. Nehemiah is going to face tremendous discouragement and at least attempts to discourage him. Let's see how he handles it. And we're going to look today at Nehemiah chapter 4. The first word we're going to read is Sanballat. Don't be surprised if you don't know what that means. That's a person. And that was the leader of the opposition against Nehemiah. And just keep in mind as we read this that there's a Sanballat in all of our lives. There's somebody out there who will try to oppose your change. And he's the leader. And we read in Nehemiah 4, Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall. He became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews. And in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from these heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Tobiah, he's enemy number 2 here, the Ammonite, who was at his side. These guys stayed together because there's strength in numbers. Tobiah, the Ammonite, was at his side. He said, what are they building? Even a fox climbing on it would break down their wall of stones. And at this point, it doesn't say this, but I think that's when they elbow each other and laugh sarcastically at them. Oh, some little fox will run it. This whole thing will fall down because they're terrible. They can't do it. This is that voice of ridicule. You'll fail. You cannot succeed. Enemies were angry with them for rebuilding, and they mocked him and they laughed at him. So notice Nehemiah's response. Always Nehemiah's response is prayer. And in verse 4, he begins to pray. Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in the land of captivity. This is not a wimpy prayer, by the way. This is an angry prayer, and this is a prayer for God to pretty much crush the enemies here. So he says, do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. Do you see what he's saying? He's asking God not to forgive them. When we pray to God, we say, Lord, forgive me of all of my sins. When we pray for our enemies, we say, don't forgive them, punish them. Forgive me, punish them. That's how he's praying right now. Now, many years later, Jesus would come by and teach, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Nehemiah didn't get that email, that memo. He's still praying, don't forgive these people, judge these people, they are enemies, they insulted us, the least you can do is destroy them. So this is not a wimpy prayer. In verse 6, he says, so, after praying his prayer, we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, and the people worked with all their heart. And he just throws that in there. This is incredible. This wall, we said, is 1.5 miles long. It's 20 feet high, probably 10 feet wide. And now it's already 10 feet high for 1.5 miles. This is an amazing thing he's done, and he just mentions it like it's nothing. The wall has reached half its height. They've made great progress, and your first thought might be, isn't that wonderful? Now they've made progress. Things will get better. No. because of the progress, their enemies got even more upset and then got worse. So look at verse 7. And he's going to give us a long list of enemies here. When Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod, this is a growing list now of his enemies. When they heard that the repairs to Jerusalem walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. Earlier they were angry. Now they're very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against them. You'll never guess what Nehemiah's response is going to be. That's right, he prayed. That's exactly. He always prays. In verse 9, but we prayed to our God and posted a guard. And posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. I love the fact that he prayed and posted a guard. You know, it's like people who are out in a storm and they're in a boat, and he says, we prayed and we rowed with all of our might. You know, you don't just pray and say, okay, God, you take care of us here. You pray and you work as hard as you can to get it done. But you're totally trusting on God to give you the strength to get it done, but you're working as hard as you can. That's not in conflict. You know, for this church to turn around and to grow and all these things, it's going to take a tremendous effort and a lot of work for a lot of people. And the whole time, it's going to take us praying and depending on God 100% for this to happen. And they're not in conflict. We don't just sit back and pray and expect God to do the work. And we also don't go out and we work and not pray about it. It's a balance. So he prays and he posts a guard. It means you're going to trust God, but you're also going to take action. In verse 10, we read, meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot build the wall. What's happening right there? They're getting discouraged. They're tired. They have done already a great task building this wall 10 feet high, but they're only halfway there, and they are tired. Remember, these are not construction workers. These are families. We read about them in chapter 2. These were goldsmiths and silversmiths, and they were priests, and they were other people. They were ordinary folks, and they were out there doing very hard physical labor for days, day and night, long days. And they were worn out. And they were at a point where they didn't think they could finish this. And I mentioned 4 steps to change. Let me give you 3 enemies to change that you got to watch out for in your own life as well as in a corporation. The first enemy to change is doubt. And that's what was creeping into their minds, was doubt. You know, this really seems like a good project, Nehemiah. I understand that Jerusalem really needs a wall. And we do got a lot of people working on this, and that's a great idea and everything, but I don't think we're going to be able to finish this. I mean, we're not professionals at this. We don't have the strength. We don't have the resources. I don't think we're going to make it. And maybe that's what has crept into your mind when you're trying to change something personally in your own life, is this doubt creeps into your mind when you say, I don't think I can do this. You know, a person who's trying to diet and lose weight, it goes okay for a few days, and then one of those days where you're really hungry and you feel weak, you say, I think I'm going to die. If I don't have one of these donuts on the way out of church today, I don't think I'll make it to the car. I think I might die. I don't think I can make it. Doubts come into your mind all the time, and you say, I just don't have the strength. I can't complete the task. The second enemy to change is distraction. This is a bad one for me. If you're ADD or ADHD, this is your worst one. You're saying, I really want to change. I'm going to do, oh, look, there's a bird. You know, we're easily distracted. And we start a project, we say, this will be a great project. We're going to do this project. And somebody says, well, what about that? We go, oh, yeah, let's try that too. And then we're doing that, we're doing this. Pretty soon the first project is forgotten. We are so easily distracted. And so maybe God places something in your heart and says, you know, this is a change you should make in your life. And you really take it seriously, and you pray about that, and you get started on it. And then some other problem creeps up in your life, and you say to yourself, I'll get back to this first project after I take care of this problem here. Maybe it's a health problem or something. I have to deal with this now. And then there's a family problem you got to deal with, and then there's something else. And you never ever get back to it because we're easily distracted. So the first enemy of change is doubt, and the second one is distraction, and the third one is despair. Despair is when you give up all hope and you say, we're doomed. We can't make it. I'll never be able to do this. And that's what these people are feeling right here, where they're saying the strength is giving out. When despair hits and you lose hope, that's when you quit. That's when you walk away from church. That's when people walk away from God. That's when people just fail. It's when despair hits. So let's look at how they dealt with these enemies that were creeping into them. In verse 11, we read, "Also our enemies said," by the way, the enemies are ramping up their attacks. "Our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put it into their work." Does this sound to you like the terrorist cells that we hear about? They're going to kind of just move into our society. They might live in your neighborhood or in your condos, and they're just quietly there, and you don't even see them coming, and all of a sudden they're going to attack you and kill you. That's what you saw in San Bernardino and other places. These people had worked with these people not knowing they were terrorists, and all of a sudden they kill you. And then others hear about that, and we get scared. What if they're in my neighborhood? What if they're in our town here? What if they're in our schools? This is the thinking of terrorists. This is the way they think. We are going to just quietly sneak up and kill you before you even know we're there. It's frightening, isn't it? And that's what they were facing with the walls. That was the rumor that was spreading among the people on the walls. Verse 12 says, "Then the Jews who lived near them came and they told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us." The people are believing this. Just like people in our society are getting more and more frightened about terrorism. And they're going to the police and they're going to the authorities in their town and saying, "You've got to do something. They're going to get us before we even realize it. They're all around us." It said they came and they told them 10 times over, wherever we turn, they're going to attack us. They're doomed. Verse 13 says, "Therefore I stationed some people behind the lowest points of the wall, at the exposed places, posting them by the families with their swords and spears and bows." Nehemiah does something brilliant here. Don't miss what he did here. First of all, he covered the weakest places. I mean, this would be a great strategy for our nation and all kinds of things as we think about what is our strategy for protecting people. But he not only covered the weakest places by putting people at the lowest places of the walls, but he posted them by families with their swords and spears and bows. He knows that they're going to be most motivated when they're protecting their families and their children, and their children's children. That's when they're going to fight to the death to protect their families. And he was brilliant by posting them with their families. This was a strategic action. And after he took action, Nehemiah is going to speak to the people. And I want you to watch this speech, because in my mind, this is a speech of great clarity. It's one of those speeches, kind of like in the movie Braveheart, when William Wallace painted his face all blue and got on the horse and rode back and forth in front of people and said, "They may take our freedom, but they'll never take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom." Remember that one? This is a William Wallace speech from Nehemiah, okay? He says in verse 14, "After I looked things over, I stood up and I said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, 'Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters and your wives and your homes. They may take your lives, but they'll never take your freedom.'" And the people roared. This is like FDR when he stood before the nation and said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." It was a great speech, and he just told the people, remember the Lord. That's where he starts off. Remember what the Lord has done. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. You see, the problem was, when you have enemies coming at you, your enemies can look really big and awesome and frightening. That's what terrorists try to do right now. ISIS has done a great job of this, of painting this picture of them as being a very vicious and a difficult group that we cannot stop them. And so people think that the enemy is so huge and so vast that they're going to defeat us. And what Nehemiah says, don't look at the size of the enemy. Look at the size of your God. Your God is great and awesome. And he is so vast that after you look at the size of your God, your enemy is going to seem microscopic in comparison. You know, at the end of this whole thing, when the enemy, Satan and everybody comes against God, God's going to win the battle by saying one little word and defeat Satan. That's how great and mighty God is. That's how small the enemy is. That's what he's going to do. And that's what Nehemiah says to them. They are so afraid. And he says, remember the God who is great and mighty. He is going to fight for you. Now look what happens after he gives that speech. Verse 15. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears and shields and bows and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried the materials did the work with one hand and held the weapon with the other. And each of the builders wore a sword at his side as he worked, but the men who sounded the alarm stayed with me. Now, if you read a passage in the New Testament about the armor of God, you read about helmets and shoes and swords and saying that we fight against an enemy we cannot see, and we need to be prepared to fight against the enemy. Nehemiah was fighting against a real physical enemy, and he was prepared, and he got all of the people prepared. They were all armed to the teeth, and they were ready for battle because they didn't know where the battle was going to happen, when it was going to happen, so all of them were ready. They were ready for a battle that never actually came. But they were prepared anyway because you don't know when the opportunity is going to come. You know, just a week ago, something amazing happened. It was in a senior living facility in Cincinnati. The man who ran that place was named Perry Gaines, and he got word that there was an 87-year-old lady who was choking in the dining room. And he ran to the dining room thinking he would perform the Heimlich maneuver. He had done that twice in the 2 years he'd been running that facility, and it was successful both times. But when he got to the dining room, there was already a 96-year-old man who was standing behind the 87-year-old woman ready to perform the Heimlich maneuver. And he let this man do that. And do you know what the man's name was, this 96-year-old man? His name was Henry Heimlich, the man who invented the procedure 40 years earlier. For 40 years, I think we have a picture of him. For 40 years, he's the one in the back behind Johnny Carson. He's demonstrating the Heimlich maneuver on The Tonight Show. For 40 years, he went around demonstrating the Heimlich maneuver to show people how to use it. But he never once used it himself in a real situation until he was 96 years old. And last week, he did it for the first time. And he saved a woman's life. Isn't that amazing? You never know when the opportunity is going to come. So Peter says, always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have. Are you prepared? Are you prepared for the battles that could come spiritually? Do you have that armor of God around you? Are you strong to fight the enemy? Are you prepared with an answer for when the opportunity comes? You never know when God is going to call you to save a life. Henry Heimlich was prepared at the age of 96. He was prepared, and he saved a life. Nehemiah made sure that his people were prepared. I want you to look at how this story ends. We're going to go to verse 19. And then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out. We are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. He's saying, join us. Be ready to come together at a moment. They have a signal prepared, and that trumpeter always was at Nehemiah's side. So as soon as the word got to him that they were under attack, he would blow that trumpet, and everyone would come together, and they would fight as one. So the principle right here is that alone is very bad. If you're out alone on that wall, you're in trouble. But if you are together, that's very good. Because when you are together, there is great strength in numbers. And this is why God puts us into a community. That's why he puts us into churches. He doesn't just sprinkle us out all over society and say, now, you go ahead and transform your neighborhoods. You share your faith with all your neighbors, and you disciple them, and you do all of that. No, he brings us together into communities where we are trained and discipled to do these things, and then we are sent out with the message. And we come back together to be strengthened by each other, to learn that God will fight for us, and to be encouraged, and then we're sent back out again. Together is strong. Verse 21. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears, from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. That's a long day, isn't it? As soon as the sun came up, they started working, and they worked until the stars came out. At that time, I also said to the people, have every man and helper stay inside Jerusalem at night, so they can serve as guards by night and as workers by day. Neither I nor my brothers nor my men or guards with me took off our clothes. Each had a weapon, and even when we went for water. They were always ready. They were ready day and night. They were always ready, always prepared. They worked together all day. They stayed together all night. And here's what happened. The enemy fled in fear. This enemy that seemed so ominous and so overpowering, when they saw the unity of these people, when they knew that their God was fighting for them, the enemy ran away like a bunch of little scared rabbits because they saw the strength. When people trust God and work together, nothing can stop them. When people trust God, they can change the world. If we trust God, right here in this church, if we trust God and we work together, we can change this church, and we can change Merritt Island, and we can change the world by the strength of God. Let's pray together. Lord, you are the